My experience in games actually strays from AR before going into VR. So when I was a kid, I was really into the Sony iToy, playing Sega Superstars, pretending I was knights and dreams. Then it started at Sony and actually worked on Book of Spells and Book of Potions. Book of Potions particularly proud of because the core of the gameplay, which is all the brewing and interactivity, which is really what the AR Wonder Book was built for. So Triangle Pits itself have done a few little small game jam titles before we decided finally, when we got our hands on the hardware, that we should actually form our own company and start making our first commercial game. And the game is Smash It Plunder. The idea, well, I've got the demo here if anyone wants to give it a go later. But the idea is that you run around the dungeon in the time limit, just destroying the place, tearing the place up, looking for treasure. That's just one of the game modes that we've got. We've got a few more on the way. As you can see, like people have said it's inspired by Minecraft. I like to think it's inspired by old games. So we like the fact that actually when you go in there, it feels like you're inside the game rather than trying to create this realistic world. We started the game back in June 2014. We knew that we wanted to actually put it onto this platform, but we couldn't show it at the time because it was still under NDA. So we ended up prototyping on the DK1 with a wireless mouse. The wireless mouse was interesting because people tried to use it as a motion controller rather than just clicking. And also our high school board was amazingly technical with post-it notes on the wall. It really helped though, bringing people into the game and getting people crowding around your game. Then in October we could finally start showing it on the gear. The interesting thing about the gear was that people can inherently know how to use the pad. People are also much more free. They can move around, just turn around on the spot because there was no wires. And then we decided to move our high school board onto a server. So the first thing that we ended up doing was looking at the platform we were putting it on. We've got all these amazing game ideas, but we didn't want to hack the game down and try and squish it onto the platform. So we looked at the platform first before looking into the game. So we started brainstorming all the advantages and disadvantages of the device, all the sort of limitations, and using those to influence the game idea rather than to just think about how to hack it in. So advantages include VR, I feel like it's really great at exploring spaces and objects in front of you. That's a key element of why everyone loves VR. The other element is empathy. So you've got a character in front of you, and that character is feeling upset. You start feeling upset for them. You can connect to them a lot easier. And then with our device, we really wanted to use the fact it was wireless, and also it had built-in controls, so we know the platform. So it was going to be a lot easier to develop for than necessarily any sort of PC range that it could be on a DK2. The limitations, of course, being on a mobile phone, it's not as powerful, so you have to think about what does that mean for our scale of the game. It's got a limited battery life, so we also want to think about how long our game experience really wants to last. Not necessarily in terms of whole length, but just in terms of play session. Also, it's a device that you might want to be using every day. The player will be using their mobile phone. They'll have a phone call come in while they're playing the game. They might have a text message come through. How does that mean for a really long narrative game? Do you want it to be broken up by some spam message coming through? The touchpad itself is also fairly limited compared to all the really cool devices you could have. Hand motion controllers or controls that allow you to feel like you're actually running. But at the end of the day, it's like you don't know if the player is actually going to have those controllers. And the fact that the game we were doing is just all in our spare time, it's just the two of us, my partner and I, so we wanted something scalable and manageable for us to create. So what we're doing now is looking at what our first minimum viable product is, basically what can we get away with launching and then updating as we go along. So, just for example of designing for your platform, take the example of the touchpad here. We knew that we wanted anyone with the device to be able to play the game. It's built in, it's simple to use, everyone knows how to use a touchpad on a laptop or your mobile phone screen. But it also still allows for some sort of player agency feeling like they're actually doing something inside that game. At first you think, wow, what am I going to do? Basically a button. But actually, there's a surprising amount of like inputs and things that you can actually read off just one button. There's obviously tapping, there's holding it, how long you're going to hold it on for, what happens when you release it. There's tracking the finger on top of the actual device, how long, what sort of distance it's going for, how fast you're moving on that device. And then of course there's gestures as well. So inside Smash It Plunder, if you want to go somewhere, you look to where you want to go to, and you just tap and it automatically take you there. To pick up objects, you just look at the object you want to pick up and you tap and hold. If you want to shake the object, try and get something out, you can rub on the pad, or you can just use your head and try and wiggle your head around. Or if you want to throw it, just swipe forward and let go and it will throw the object. And of course you can use all these in context sensitive inside your game. So you've got things like cupboards where you can look at the cupboard and swing it open. So once you've understood your platform, you can start moving on to your developing your game concept. And really what we did first was look at why we wanted to use VR. You don't want to necessarily create a game which can be just ported like onto 2D screens. We wanted something that only really works in VR. VR makes this game awesome because, so things like the 3D depth, the fact that there's this curiosity when you first put on devices. Everyone's like, oh, what's that? And then immediately they've got this curiosity frame of mind when you start playing your game. There's a lot about discovery and exploration. Of course, it makes it really believable. And then, there's just pretty much like design basics here, but you want to think about the core pillars of your game. The ideas that you're going to share with the rest of the team saying, this is what we're really going for, guys. If we aren't hitting these marks, then we're not really got a really core gameplay focus done. So in Smash It Plunder, I wanted it to feel like it was a really full game experience. So for our first VR title, the most important thing for us was a sense of agency. There's a lot of cockpit shooters out there which you just look to where you want to shoot and it automatically shoots things down. Whereas we wanted you to feel like that you're actually touching things, you got this tactile feeling. The VR at the moment is in its early phases where you're just sort of looking at these really cool experiences and films, but in terms of games, you need to feel like have that interactivity and being tactile, like there's something really in front of you, and having that into your gameplay will make it feel like it's a real experience that you're actually there. So just like an artist, we created a mood board, but only for gameplay as well. Some of these aren't really for our game, so things like narrative and learning, but having a feeling mood board will again just help game stay on track and focused. Then when we started trying to communicate our game to our people before, while it's in our prototype phase, it was helped really having game references. It meant that it was really easy to communicate to the rest of our team, saying, okay, it's rather like this bit and that bit of that game. It doesn't actually have to necessarily be about games. It could be books or films or TV shows or whatever. But in Smash It Plunder, it was things like the Lego games, where in Lego games you want to run around, you want to destroy every single thing that's smashable and collect all those little tiny studs. You wanted to get that feeling inside our game. And Luigi's Mansion and LEDs have that feeling of, wow, this is actually existing, like the money actually floats around. LEDs have some really cool interactions. So as soon as we started prototyping our idea, we started having to think about player comfort. What that is basically making sure when people play your game, they don't feel sick. Comfort is something you really do have to design in from the very start of the game, because it can have some serious effects on your gameplay. You have to also remember that everyone is different. Some players, when they start playing, if they're really okay in VR, they actually get annoyed at some of the normal comfort VR things we put in. And then there's players that need extra help. So there's a potential range of options that we have for players. Some that you obviously want to have all the time, such as high FPS and not freezing the screen on your face. It's a really uncomfortable feeling. And then there's some which might be optional but have a massive effect on gameplay. So forward-only gameplay is really easy to do in VR and is a really comfortable experience, but then obviously that has a massive limitation to the type of game you can play. Having a large cockpit stops as much visual noise around you. It has this massive frame reference and makes it feel like the world is moving rather than you're moving, so you don't get sickness from the G-forces. But again, that means I have to make a cockpit game. So as a developer, it's all about where you want to actually put this line. So first of all, explaining about how G-forces work. When you're actually moving around inside the game at the moment, there's this bit of a feeling when, if you've got all the comfort off, when you start the movement, you feel like you want to compensate and swing backwards. And we see it a lot. If you've got all the comfort all the way down, press the button, you see everyone just go this a little bit. And that's because your body's expecting a bit of G-force, or at least a little bit of force momentum, and it's trying to compensate itself automatically. For example, there's a lot of roller coaster games out there, and well, for VR anyway, and some of them are really bad in terms of trying to make the players' real-life G-forces actually in the game be the same. So, for example, if you turn a player flat, that makes them feel incredibly ill because they expect them to swing outwards, but obviously they're not doing that in real life, so that makes them feel ill. Whereas if you create your roller coaster so their G-force is actually pointing down when they go into the corner, you bank the turn, that won't make them feel ill at all because they're expecting their G-forces down because they're sitting down. Only player control movement basically means not pushing the player around, like in strange cutscenes or etc., or not showing them where they're going. Snap turning is basically based on ballerinas turning. So when a ballerina turns around, they have a point of reference. And when they turn, they basically snap their head around. So what we do is, if you're turning in the game 50 degree, when you're turning in the game and you're having to sit down and play, so you can only sit down forward, and not crick your wreck around, then you snap the player at 15-degree increments. So you don't blend them round in a circle. That's trying to stop. It's trying to stop them from feeling ill by having all this visual noise flying in front of them. And then finally, we've got our we've got three now types of movement. Blink movement is basically when you point somewhere and you appear there. You just teleport there. You don't bother with all the movement. And then you've got the static skybox, which basically, instead of having like a sun and you turn around and the sun then is behind you, you have the sun always in front of you. So then it looks really strange, but then it also looks like the world's moving rather than you're moving. So the things that we're doing in Smash It Plunder are, if you want to look all the way around, the only way you can really do that is by physically turning round. I have to keep reminding players to actually turn their feet when they do so. But there's a natural limit, so then you just don't feel sit. It's like I'm turning 1-to-1. This is what I do in normal real life. People with motor conditions can still play the game though, with an extra option to be able to turn on swipe turning, which means if you just swipe, it snaps you around at those 15-degree increments. Instead of a cockpit, we actually have these hands for reference and a book that fly with you. Acts as that little bit of grounding, but we also have these stabilisation cubes, which is our form of an internal skybox. This magical dust in the game that stays with the player, rather than the player moving through them, it stays with the player, and so when you turn within the cubes, but then when you're moving forward, there's always these solid things in front of you. It's trying to fool your brain to thinking, oh, the world's moving rather than I'm moving within the world. When you start moving forwards, you don't have a slow acceleration up to that speed. You're immediately at that speed. There's no frames of acceleration as such, or at least there is only one frame of acceleration. The acceleration is your brain. Whenever you accelerate in real life, your brain is your body is experiencing forces. So when you accelerate in the game, you expect those sort of forces too. And if you don't get them, again, you feel ill. So for players to really feel like they're there, they need to feel like they're really absorbed into the game. They need to feel like they've got any sort of effect on the world rather than just observing it. You need to feel like they've actually got some sort of impression upon it. You can do this a few different ways. For example, you can use it like various effects like shadows and footprints and dust smokes kicking about the player. With reflections, you obviously have to sort of think about, well, that means you have to draw some sort of player avatar rather than this ghost. But the way that we find is the best way to do it is just build it into the gameplay. So in Smash It Plunder, they feel like they're there because they're interacting with the world all the time. They're picking up things in front of them and they're making a mess. So building it into the gameplay is just a really easy way of making players feel like they're there. And to make the world a believable space, you have to take care in designing the actual space. First of all, get the scale right. So we did this wrong and ended up costing us a week just remodelling everything to the right scale. The player can also look everywhere and anywhere, and they will do. They can look in every single corner. When you're playing a normal FPS, you don't tend to look behind you, you don't tend to look just around the bend. But when they're in VR, players will just go everywhere. So just make sure there isn't any buggy geometry, not a single bit of Z fighting, because that'll just drop you out of the game straight away. And then players are expecting a coherent world with predictable rules, so that isn't necessarily a realistic world. What that means is that if I drop a glass, for example, I expect it to shatter. It just means that all your rules in the game are consistent. And then if players want to explore, you should reward it. So just make sure you don't have really empty corners where there's just nothing there. They've spent their time going there and reward it with something. Now, it doesn't have to necessarily be collectible, it doesn't have to be something like money or XP, but it can be something like story or narrative, or just like a little interesting prop there. Now, when it comes to horror games, we're going to end up having our first VR heart attack if we're not really careful. But what you want to make sure is that there's some sort of safe space that the player can quickly escape to. You're already really vulnerable with this big piece of hardware stuck in your face. You can't look away from the screen, it's attached to your face. And what you're going to end up doing, if you get scared, you're going to tear off the kit. So the best thing that you can do is basically be able to have a really quick start menu that just lights up the entire room, makes it feel like a really nice safe space again. Or potentially have alternate routes. So, for example, you don't really want to go down somewhere because I have a phobia of spiders. I know that's going to be full of spiders, there's spider webs everywhere. So maybe create a different route. It requires more skill, perhaps, but at least the player knows they won't have to encounter their greatest fear. So when players first start in a game, they're going to end up needing a little time to get used to things. Don't even know to turn their head more often than not. On top of needing time to settle, they'll also be attracted to the first visually complexing thing they see. So, for example, this is a screenshot for like the very first prototype we ended up having. We started players facing the door, so they're forced to turn around. First of all, being a door, people felt like they could interact with it, so we've changed that to a wall. Second thing is, if people turned right, that was absolutely fine. People saw the room straight away. When they turned left instead to start the game, they saw this awesome looking bookcase and spent their whole 2 minutes of the game just tearing apart this really colourful thing. Because this thing is like, this is the first 3D virtual object they've seen in their life. So they just wanted to play with it all the time. So we actually made our beginning room really boring in some regards. There's nothing there, so you feel like you want to move forward and you want to see more. In terms of also balancing the arcade timers, we found that like the first minute was basically a waste. So what I've ended up doing was, in the tutorial room, there's no timer at all. You can stay in there for as long as you can, explore, just getting used to it, and it's clearly the only way to move forward is going through a door. And that door is clearly going to end up starting the game and take you to something more. And that's when we start the timer, when you go through that door. So being the game, at some point you're going to need some sort of menus and UI, even if that's like a pause menu, or you need to see how much time is left, or some sort of health. So to keep the players in the game though, you don't want to have some floating UI on the screen. You don't want to necessarily have anything attached to the face that's really jarring, and you won't even be able to see it. You'd end up sort of trying to chase it like you do with the little floating bits you get in your eyes. It's like, oh, what's that? So two things you could probably do is, first of all, have real-world props displaying information instead. Things that really make context in-game make sense. So in Book of Potions, we wanted to show the temperature of the cauldron, but we didn't want to have a big number over the top. The number didn't matter. So what we did was end up just having a real thermometer inside there. It just makes it feel like more part of the game world. And then for menus, having a prop with the player that they can bring up that makes sense. So is that a tablet, or we've got a magical book. So when they go into a menu, it's actually all the menus are on top of this book. So the book's actually had an interesting history. Originally all we needed to do was really show the time to the player. We thought that having the time on the wall in giant letters would make it really obvious, but turns out that people are really too busy just smashing things to notice it or even bother looking up. Of course, they might not even be facing that direction. If they turn right, they never saw that time. So we moved it to your hand, in fact a watch on your hand. It's like, oh, that makes sense. You look down to check the time on your hand. But then players end up sort of chasing the hand around, and we're using the hands to do things in the game that are moving away from you. We also need to show a lot more information rather than just stick with a timer. For example, in our scavenger hunt mode, you're sort of given a clue and you're told to find that object. And we also wanted to show what your current score was, so in our high score board, you didn't have to wait until the very end. You knew you had some sort of pressure to try and get some more score. And that's when we moved it all to this magical book. The magical book's great because A, you can turn pages to show more information, but B, you obviously have basically an infinite amount of space then to therefore show information. As a note as well, the actual text in the book had to have a much higher resolution than we expected, just because of the fact that it's being drawn in a really small area of the device. And then a quick note about implementation. We have to keep it at 60 frames a second pretty much all the way through development. It's not just because we're showing it off all the time, but it's also because it stops us from feeling ill. Also, when it comes to creating a crosshair, what you normally do in a game is to just set a crosshair at a set distance away. But if there's an object that comes closer than that distance and the crosshair draws on top of that object, it starts fighting. It's like, oh, what's that? What's happening? Your eyes are trying to decipher if it's at the crosshair distance away or is it at the object distance away. So you have to have this depth-aware crosshair, which basically means a laser pointer that just sits on the first thing it sits on and it scales according to distance. And then for when it comes to characters and characterization in the game, you have to have a fair chance for all players to be absorbed into the game. It's really jarring when you look down and you see, and it's not your body. It's like, that's not me, it doesn't have breasts, that's really strange. Are you forcing the player to play as themselves? Are you giving them some sort of reason why they're inside this body? So what can you do about that? Well, first of all, you can go the really expensive route and do character customization and arm IKs to try and make everything one-to-one mapped. But really that's incredibly expensive, especially for most guys in here. You can then potentially just draw the hands and just cover them, or just cover just the body, so it's like big sets of armour or something. But then when you look down, the armour's not quite right, it's like, oh, that's not how it fit on my body. Then that looks really peculiar. So in Smash It Plunder, we only have the hands, which will eventually be in gloves as well. So it's like, well, pretty much everyone that expects to play the game will have hands. Or you can have no body at all. And there's quite a few experiences now where like the only interaction you have with the world are things that are coming from you, like lasers or bullets. And when it comes to your story, are you going to be forcing the player to do certain interactions? If you're feeling like the player is playing as themselves, like they're doing Fallout, and you're forcing them to do something, they go, hold on, that's not what I'll do in real life, this feels really peculiar. and then come out of the game and don't really feel like they're there. I think everyone's using this word presence. So maybe when you do that, which is part of the story, you want to give it some sort of positive spin, or be a little bit more sensitive in how you sort of communicate. Like, okay, yes, you do have to murder this person, but you know what, they're a really evil person, don't worry about it. So VR is this massive, awesome, great escape, but everyone has human social needs. It's an interesting side effect of VR that you're actually probably, well, you are the only person in there. You're the only person in this whole environment. You're surrounded by this hardware on your face, you can't just look around to see your friends, and humans drive out some sort of social interaction. So this might lead to people leaving your game a little earlier than you thought. Also, AI will end up being a social link. So having sort of broken AI might feel a little jarring. It's like, oh, okay, he's running a bit peculiar. Oh, why is he running into the wall? Personalities also need to be real and seem real, otherwise the whole world just seems fake and like you're on a TV set. So first thing you need to do is have some sort of social outlet. And this doesn't necessarily need to be a human or some sort of animal. Like GLaDOS and Companion Cubes do a pretty good job of just feeling like you're connected to something in the world. You're not just there alone. And also you want to make sure that your AI doesn't actually appear stupid, but also their personalities need to feel real, and dialogue needs to be realistic as well. So it's just making sure they're consistent. So if I become friendly with someone in the game, and all of a sudden that person backstabs me, okay, that's fair enough. But then if they suddenly good friends with me again, and then they backstab me again, it's like, that doesn't seem very well. Why is this character doing this thing to me? Oh yeah, because it's a game, and then you've lost the player again. They don't feel like they're there. And of course, VR doesn't actually have to necessarily be single player. So this is our shared screen, which has our leaderboard on, which has this competitive element. But it also shows the player, shows us where the player is. So people can sort of join in and banter and say, oh no, turn left, go down here instead. It's not just the game environment that we have to worry about, there's obviously the real world around them. So if you're creating this, yeah, if you're creating this, yeah. If you're creating this active experience, you have to just be aware of where your game might be played and avoid really large actions. I mean, this obviously comes to effect more when you've got big motion controllers and you're asking the player to swing massive bats. It's hard enough, obviously, well, hard enough. It's obviously dangerous enough with the Wii when it first came out, where people get a little too into it about the condom things they put on them now. But then, basically, like, if you've got the hardware on your face, you can't see where you're hitting. Especially when there's no room tracking at the moment, or at least there wasn't until 2 days ago with Valve. And then obviously in the perfect experience as well, people are going to get lost in your game and sort of lose track of time, and at some point they want to pop out and just see what time it is. Why don't you allow them to see what time it is inside the game, or even built it into your experience? Is that some sort of clocks on the wall actually tell you the real time? Just build it in so they don't have to necessarily take off the unit to be able to tell what time it is.
Also, in case of don't play on bridges.
Don't play on bridges. Yeah, that's probably not a good idea. That's probably more self-preservation than anything else.
Yeah, don't have a VR presence next to the Grand Canyon.
And then, obviously, the other thing you want to do is actually plan for how long your game will end up being played. If it's because it's a limited battery for the GearVR at least, but also because if players are going to be staying in VR for a very long time, do you want to feel like you want to do that to players as a developer? It's like, this is a really solitary experience. Just allow for clear breaks in place so the player knows it's like, okay, now is a nice time to take off the unit and go to the loo or eat. And finally, you've created this amazing game, this awesome experience, but you really do have to play test it often. As a developer, you are the worst person to judge how fun or comfortable an experience is, and this is especially the case with a VR game. It started showing in Smash It Plunder when it was 3 weeks old as a prototype, which is no time at all, and this was 3 weeks of working after work and just weekends as well. Even without being on final hardware, it's incredibly useful and really valuable. There were so many little changes we made from our first first 3-week demo to our first 4-week demo that we did. And just make sure you actually listen and watch. Just don't argue back to the players. It's amazing how many developers go, oh no, wait, oh no, and then do this, and I'll do that, no, please, no, that's coming, etc. Don't argue with them, just sort of take it and go, yeah, that's great, that's cool. Yes, I have got something in the works. And then watch for their physical movements and facial expressions. So fortunately enough, when people have the device on their faces, they don't tend to hold back how much they smile. They sort of forget they're there and forget you're there and just see them, or you can see them getting frowning, etc., etc. But just also for us, like when we started with the movement, like I said about the waving, that's when we sort of knew that when people started walking and they started swaying, we needed to do some more for players. And then there's of course recording information, any sort of data you can. So share screen again is like another useful thing for us, because on the gear we can't see what you're doing. It's really frustrating trying to playtest people when you can't see them. So what we do is just take the camera positions inside the game and just remount them to a PC version of the game. And then, so we can watch you run around, we can see what you're smashing, what you're picking up. That's great as a level designer. But what we'll also do is save out that information. So we can just replay at any point and just go, oh okay, players keep going for the bookcase straight away, we should probably change that. It's also a really great centerpiece if you're creating a space where, so it's like, you've got this massive projector, hey look, come look at our game. And then events with VR, like non-VR players, you need to make sure that your space is really approachable and that your hardware looks approachable. So this is the older version of the gear that we actually covered up. First of all, because we weren't allowed to show necessarily the older hardware, but secondly, because it was this really black device, and so for some of the OAPs at Game City that ended up playing on this, it's like, this is a really scary device that I'm going to put on my face. So we ended up covering it in pixel art, which there's a multiple amount of things, but basically it looks like this is a really friendly thing. It also made people want to take photos of the product, and obviously they quote us saying, oh, it's Smash It Plunder, when really all they're doing is taking a photo of a 3D thing that we've made. But what it also did was start blending the pixelated world, which is some of the little props we've made, into the real world. And it's setting up the players' expectations for when they start going into the game. It's like, we're blending these two worlds together, you're really going inside this virtual world. So you want to be designing the whole experience for the player. So when they first go into the room, what they're going to see. What they're going to see when you see your space. And what they're going to do, what you're going to say to them when they put on the device. Even to when they stop playing with the game, what you're going to get them to do. It's like, design that whole experience, including what all their friends might be like. And that's all there is. Any questions?
Nice, that was awesome. So has anyone got any questions?
Yeah, I'm really curious about the little cubes that you have to sort of make it feel like the skybox is sort of not turning, but you are.
Yeah.
With those, does that still work if they're sort of moving around? So if they're sort of, I don't know, just doing a little sort of
so
motion
we actually wiggle them very slightly and try and make them feel a little more natural. But their speed is so slow that it makes them feel natural, but it also makes them feel a little more stationary than like normal disc modes, which end up swirling and catching around. So we actually have 2 modes on this. We've got like the comfort off, and this is like the comfort normal mode where you have the cubes. So later you can give it a go and see what they actually look like when they're moving around you if you want.
Yeah, I was just thinking in terms of like if you actually wanted to incorporate that into the gameplay in a sort of I suppose theme narrative sense, and it's like, okay, how can we kind of explain having these like little cubes around? If it was like sort of floaty magic dust or something around you, that would make more sense.
We've got that. So like we've got, when you pick up something in the game, Originally it was a hand sticking out, and it wasn't enough information, so we turned to this big magical beam, which has smaller versions and more brighter versions of these cubes swirling around it, so it feels like your presence is causing these magical dust and cubes. So there is a bit of context to it and how we designed it. I mean, obviously, like, it doesn't have to be cubes, it doesn't have to be blue cubes and stuff. So it's going to be a hard challenge for a lot of people, especially if it's a game that's entirely based indoors, to make this sort of static skybox. But yeah, just think hard, and you should imagine you come up with some sort of interesting context for them.
Thanks. Who's next? We've seen a lot of investment from big players, Facebook buying Oculus Rift, that sort of thing. But these hardware devices, the technology is interesting and cool and new, but they need a killer app, like any piece of hardware. So is there an investment of
Sorry?
Is there an investment, a freeing up of capital by these large investment companies that, like Facebook, for content creators? Are they creating funds or incubators to try and get that killer app, that software?
Yeah, so there was a thing a while ago, which I believe the Darknet guys announced at GDC, so this isn't a bad thing to say anymore, but basically Oculus were offering, well, not Oculus, I think it was Samsung were offering publishing deals for people trying to get their stuff onto Gear. That was a while ago and they stopped doing that. But now they're trying to do it again with the Oculus VR Jam, where they're offering quite a lot of prize money. I think it was like 500. They're offering like over two. What was it?
I think it started at 100 and went up to about 500.
Yeah, it's like $500 million for first prize in making a really cool game or app, or both. So there are things out there now. We haven't necessarily tried to get any publishing deals because this is still like something that's a bit more part-time. We're okay just trying to do this part-time for now. But when we did try and get some money originally just to buy Unity Pro, which we needed at the time, we couldn't necessarily find anyone that would give us the initial investment just for that. That was because we had to try and, in additional publisher sense, we have to try and prove there's a market. And of course, VR hasn't launched yet. In fact, we couldn't even tell them about the Oculus store that was coming online. It's like, there is a market, there will be a market, there's an Oculus, like it's basically an Oculus version of iTunes. And unfortunately, we couldn't prove them, we couldn't give them any figures. So yeah, like, it's gonna take a few waves of games and applications to come out before ever investment opportunities come online, I believe.
Sure. Thanks.
Any other questions? Cool. I have a question actually. How important is the frame rate to the comfort of the VR experience?
It's insanely important, but fortunately Oculus are trying to help developers a bit. So what you expect normally is like to have a 60 frames solid frame rate, but there are times when that's just not entirely possible. You might have the odd frame drop when you're going between rooms or when something else is loading. They've got something called Time Warp, which really helps covers those little gaps. It's not something that you want to rely on. You still want to be hitting 60 frames a second. Otherwise, when you turn around, you get this horrible jaggediness. You get, like, it feels like you're in slow-mo, it feels like you're in syrup when you're turning. It's horrible, and it makes you feel really queasy.
Yeah, sure.
No, of course not.
Hi. First of all, I have actually tried it, and I may recommend. That was awesome. Secondly, obviously you're going through GearVR, and you mentioned, I think at the start of the talk, you did your first prototype on Oculus Rift.
The DK1. Yeah.
I would be interested to know, I mean, I think a lot of us have, gone to, say, Unity or Unreal or whatever, because it's a cross-platform development environment. We don't like porting again and again to all these platforms. That same thing's probably going to happen with virtual reality. Do you think there are things that we can do now that will make that easier? Because obviously you've got a custom controller on the side of your head, you've got the things in your hands. Are there things
that make that easier, or tips? Thanks.
Yeah, first of all, there's a bit of to and fro going on. So Oculus are really helping because now they've actually finally started to merge the mobile version of the SDK with the DK2 version, which means you don't have to like swap between projects or try and upkeep two versions of your game. Also, the touchpad's really easy because it's basically just a mouse input. So they haven't made it into this complicated thing. They've basically gone, what is the easiest input that anyone can do? Mouse clicks. Okay, let's put that into the hardware. But then again, there are like middleware companies and like people that are making HMD devices that are trying to sort of be in the middle there. So there's open source VR, OSVR, which is looking like it might be something which will be adaptable. So you can like put things onto the OSVR and it will work on a few different VR devices. And then there's Valve were originally trying to do like their version of that, which is basically you build for Valve VR, and then again it works on all the VR devices. Like they do all that hard work. So there's software stuff coming out basically that's going to help with that. But in terms of me as a creator, like I'm designing for the lowest common denominator, I guess. It's like this, if it works on this, it'll work even better when you've got motion controllers, it'll work even better when you've got the treadmill stuff, it'll work even better when it's in super high resolution and positional tracking. So it's like, as long as your core idea works with just like the simplest tools you can do, you can pretty much port it to anything else after that.
So we can start with cardboard now.
Yep, look down here.
Another question? I know you've got a bit of experience of working with sort of AR and VR generally, but was there anything that really caught you off guard when you were coming to design this game compared to like any other game because of the VR element?
Not necessarily because of the VR element. This is probably my first title really working so closely on mobile devices, because I've been a console developer before that. So that came to a shock to the system. It's like, obviously...
What resources?
Yeah, exactly. Like, what draw calls? Oh god, what are those? Why is there so few of them? Or why is there so many in my game? But yeah, so that was the first shock. But then I guess I see AR and VR so different. Like, so not too long ago, The Guardian was asking people about, HoloLens versus virtual reality and Oculus. It's like, these things aren't versus, they are totally different products. Like, VR is great for teleporting you inside worlds, and AR is great for making you feel like there's something there in front of you in real world, but it's really bad for teleporting you inside virtual worlds. But VR is obviously really bad at doing that. It's like, they've all got their pros and cons, they're so different. I mean, they will probably end up converging at some point, and that'd be great, but not quite yet. And then when it comes to stuff I did on Morpheus, it was mainly, I mean, obviously at the time I knew what the Morpheus was capable of and it had positional tracking. So when it came to this, which doesn't have positional tracking, it doesn't know if you're bending your knees, it was a bit of a disappointment. It's like, oh, I want to be able to peek underneath things. But ultimately, I didn't want to necessarily disregard the whole idea because I couldn't quite do that yet, because we are looking at potentially porting it to other platforms at some point. So again, it's like making sure that the game was fun with just you at the one height, that's great, and then anything extra is a bonus.
Any other questions at all?
So yeah, I'd be like hanging around demoing it ultimately.
Yeah, there's a tea break at 3:45 for about half an hour, so that's probably a good time to come and have a chat. Cool, thank you very much.